That morning, sunlight streamed through the iron bars. A group of German prisoners sat waiting for their usual rations when something unusual happened. An American guard approached, not only carrying bread and coffee, but also a stack of newspapers. "Newspapers," he said curtly, tossing them onto the wooden table. The entire room fell silent for a few seconds. A blonde-haired prisoner named Carl snatched one up, his eyes lighting up like a child seeing a toy for the first time. "My God, real newspapers, real news," he shouted with trembling excitement. But before he could read, another hand ripped it away. Hans, a former SS officer, his face flushed red, barked, "Don't be a fool. This is American propaganda. They want to humiliate us." Carl yanked it back, tearing a corner of the paper. Other prisoners rushed in. "Let me see. What does it say? Is it true Berlin was bombed so heavily?" A young soldier cried out. The air was tight as a drawn wire. One side believed this was a rare chance to know the truth. The other insisted American press was nothing but lies, poison meant to break their spirit. The shouting grew louder. "You're a traitor for believing the enemy. And you're blind, too afraid to face reality." Then, whack! A fist smashed into a face. Blood trickled from a lip. Chairs clattered to the floor. Prisoners shoved and stumbled, boots trampling wildly. Outside the fence, 2 American guards stood with arms crossed. One smirked. "See? They fight each other. We don't have to do a thing." The other exhaled smoke with a chuckle. "A newspaper is stronger than a rifle." Inside, chaos raged on. Hans lunged again for the paper, but Carl clutched it to his chest, screaming, "We have the right to know the truth. We're not blind puppets." At last, the guards had to step in. A piercing whistle shrieked. Soldiers stormed in, forcing the prisoners apart, slamming them back onto benches. The room quieted, leaving only heavy breaths and burning stares. The newspaper, crumpled and stained with blood, still lay on the floor. The bold headline on the front page read, "Berlin bombed again. Heavy damage reported." Carl looked down, eyes glistening, unsure if it was truth or a trap. Hans ground his teeth, boiling with rage. And the Americans, watching from afar, simply smiled. They knew. From now on, they wouldn't need rifles or whips. A single newspaper was enough to divide the prisoners, plant seeds of doubt, and let the enemy destroy itself. After the morning brawl, the prisoner camp sank into a strange silence. The German POWs, who usually gossiped about food or work hours, now only sat with heads lowered, glancing from time to time at the crumpled newspaper lying in the corner. The paper was no longer whole. The front page was torn, smeared with blood and boot marks. But to them, it was like a secret doorway had just opened, revealing a world beyond the barbed wire, a world they never thought they would glimpse as prisoners. That afternoon, an American guard suddenly walked in. He carried another stack of newspapers, tossed them onto the long table, and left without a word. Several prisoners rushed forward, their hands trembling as they picked them up. Carl was the first to dare spread a page open. His eyes scanned the dense English text. He couldn't understand everything, but the photos told the story. A city in ruins, thick smoke columns rising from charred rooftops. Beneath it, bold letters screamed, "Berlin bombed again. Heavy damage reported." Carl's heart clenched. He didn't know if his family was still alive. He wanted to believe this was a trick, but the images were too clear, undeniable. Beside him, Otto, a young soldier, leaned in. "Is it true? Could Berlin really be lost?" Carl said nothing, only gripped the paper tighter. Across the room, Hans scoffed. "Fools! These are fake pictures. Americans are masters of staging. Don't let them deceive you." He stood up, voice sharp with anger. "Germany never loses. The Führer will never allow it." But his words no longer carried the same iron certainty. Even his supporters exchanged uneasy glances. Another prisoner, Dieter, who knew more English, began reading aloud the smaller articles. There was sports news. The New York Yankees had just won a major game. An advertisement showed a gleaming refrigerator with the slogan, "Every American home deserves one." The prisoners gasped. A cooling machine for the whole family? Impossible. Back home, only the wealthy could dream of such a thing. Dieter nodded, then continued. There was a feature on a new Hollywood movie with a smiling actress on the cover. The younger prisoners stared in awe, like schoolboys seeing a color picture for the first time. For a moment, the harsh truth of war seemed to fade. In front of them was another America, full of life, sports, art, and luxuries beyond imagination. Could it be we've been lied to all along? A soft voice whispered. No one answered, but many eyes flickered with doubt. Hans shouted again, desperate to regain control. Don't believe it! It's a trap. Reading this only makes us weak. Germans must stay strong. Yet his voice, echoing across the barracks, sounded like thunder in a canyon, loud but hollow. All evening, the prisoners passed the papers around. Those who could read translated for those who couldn't. They argued, whispered, debated. Some broke down in tears, worrying for families in Berlin. Others laughed dryly, saying this was at least a chance to practice English. Then came the most surprising act. A group of prisoners decided to keep the newspaper as a treasure. They folded it carefully, passed it hand to hand, hid it under mattresses, as if it was a lifeline to the world beyond. Outside, the American guards quietly watched. They didn't need to interfere. With just a few cheap newspapers, they had planted something more dangerous than whips: doubt. When night fell, the camp sank into silence. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of tortured thoughts, of shaken beliefs, of shattered dreams about a victory that would never come. And it all began with a simple newspaper that seemed so harmless. The next day, newspapers were handed out again. This time, no one fought to the point of bloodshed, but their eyes were still tense, burning with hunger. Each paper was passed carefully from hand to hand, like a shared treasure of the entire barracks. Karl sat quietly in the corner, his gaze fixed on an advertisement. A brightly colored picture showed an American family at breakfast, boxes of cereal, a glass of milk, fresh orange juice. The father smiled, the mother looked elegant, the little blonde child bounced happily. Look, Karl whispered, showing it to Otto. Do they really live like this every day? Even during wartime, their tables are still this full? Otto nodded, his eyes glimmering with both admiration and envy. Back home, many German families had no bread left to eat. Dieter was fascinated by the sports section. He read aloud, "The New York Yankees win again. Player Joe DiMaggio remains the brightest star." Some prisoners shook their heads, clueless about baseball, but when Dieter explained it was a game watched by millions of Americans, their eyes lit up. Millions watching just a ball game. Back home, that's unthinkable. All we have is war, nothing else for joy. Then came the entertainment pages. A Hollywood actress beamed from the paper, dressed in a dazzling gown. One young prisoner blushed and whispered, "If there's a next life, I'd like to meet a woman like her." The group burst into laughter, the rare sound of joy in their days of captivity. The small articles became topics for distraction, helping them forget the gloom of war. They debated, was America truly that wealthy, or was it all a show? Some insisted it was real. America was an industrial giant. Others claimed it was a psychological trick. They want us to feel inferior, to give up hope. But no matter who was right, no one could deny it. Those newspapers had opened a completely different world. Even Hans, though still shouting, could not hide his curiosity. He secretly read the lifestyle section. There was news of a new school being built in a small town. He frowned. Even while at war, they build schools? Another prisoner laughed. In Germany, we build more bunkers than schools. The atmosphere in the room shifted. From fear and suspicion, it turned into quiet reflection, full of questions. The prisoners began to look beyond the barbed wire, not just with their eyes, but with imagination. They pictured bustling American streets filled with cars. They imagined theaters glowing with neon light. They dreamed of small houses with green yards, where families lived in peace without sirens screaming in the night. Carl even whispered, "If I'm ever free again, I want to see New York with my own eyes." His words enraged Hans. "Shut your mouth! Have you forgotten who you are? We are German soldiers, warriors of the Reich. Our duty is not to dream about America." But this time, no one applauded. Instead, some bowed their heads in silence, while others looked at Hans with tired, disappointed eyes. His authority no longer held the same weight. Outside, the American guards kept watching. They didn't need to interfere. They knew that with just one newspaper, the prisoners were comparing, questioning, and dividing themselves. The paper had become a window into a world they had never touched before. A world both beautiful and strange, full of allure. It forced the prisoners to ask, what are we really fighting for? And why does the enemy live so well? That night, conversations murmured through the barracks. Some dreamed, some raged, some despaired. But all of them admitted, since the arrival of newspapers, they were no longer the same men. Another world had entered their minds, through fragile, terrible pages, yet stronger than bullets. In the days that followed, newspapers were no longer a strange sight. Each morning, when the American guards tossed a bundle of printed sheets onto the table, the prisoners' eyes lit up. They rushed forward, not for bread or coffee anymore, but to grab the news. For many, the papers became a lifeline. Carl, who had little schooling, suddenly grew determined to learn English. He matched words from the newspaper with German, asking Dieter to explain. On a scrap of paper, he scribbled, "Home, house, freedom, Freiheit, food, Essen." Otto became obsessed with the sports section. He asked the guards about baseball, curious about the rules. One afternoon, a guard threw him an old ball, and almost instantly, a group of prisoners began practicing swings in the yard. Laughter rang out, rare sounds replacing the sighs that usually filled the camp. But not everyone was pleased. Hans, the former SS officer, grew more furious by the day. He watched his comrades laugh, learn English, even chat with American guards, and it burned inside him. To him, each newspaper was a dagger stabbing at German pride. "What are you doing?" Hans roared one afternoon. "Have you forgotten who we are? These papers are weapons. They're destroying your will to fight, turning you into slaves in your own minds." But his words no longer struck fear. Instead, some prisoners snapped back. "At least we get to know the truth." "Are you so sure there are no lies in Germany? The Americans let us read. That proves they're not afraid of the truth." Hans slammed his fist against the wall, his face flushed red, but he could not win the argument. Meanwhile, the papers quietly reshaped their thoughts. Prisoners realized America was not just the land of the enemy, but also a land of opportunity, of dreams. They read about small towns where children still went to school, where workers filled factories, where evenings meant gathering at the movies. Images so different from their homeland, swallowed by smoke and rubble. Some began keeping journals, recording what they read. One prisoner wrote simply, "Today I read that Americans have refrigerators in their kitchens. I wish my mother had one, so the meat wouldn't spoil." Another wrote, The Americans are clever. They don't beat us. They give us newspapers. They give us hope. But that hope may make us forget we are prisoners. The hidden tension gave the camp an atmosphere both light and uneasy. Faith was shaken, hatred dimmed, but deep divisions grew, some eager to learn, others determined to resist. And all of it sparked by a few cheap sheets of paper, printed on fragile newsprint, yet more powerful than any weapon. While the German prisoners argued, laughed, and even learned English through the papers, on the other side of the fence the Americans had a very different view. To them, each newspaper handed out wasn't a random act of kindness. It was part of a larger plan. From the beginning of the war, U.S. authorities had wrestled with a question. How could they manage hundreds of thousands of prisoners without violating the Geneva Convention? They didn't want to gain the reputation of cruelty like the Axis powers. Yet, they also didn't want the POWs so comfortable that they became a burden. The solution they chose was simple but profound. Use information as a weapon. One senior officer put it bluntly. A gun can silence a prisoner, but a newspaper can make him question the entire war. For the guards, watching the Germans argue over headlines was as good as winning a battle without firing a shot. They stood outside, smoking, smirking at Hans, screaming in rage, while Karl clung to every printed word. "See that?" One guard told his buddy. "We don't have to torture them. They're already tearing themselves apart." His friend nodded, eyes sly. "Exactly." The papers don't just report news, they plant an idea. America is strong and prosperous, while their homeland crumbles. But not everyone agreed. Among the U.S. soldiers were voices of protest. Some younger men bristled. "Why are we being nice to the enemy? My brother died at Normandy, and now his killers get to sit around reading newspapers and laughing." Others worried. If the prisoners know too much, what if they find ways to send information back home? These doubts reached all the way to Congress. Some lawmakers accused the government of spoiling the enemy. American newspapers ran sharp headlines. "The enemy eats well, sleeps warm, reads news, while our boys die on the front." Still, the Pentagon stood firm. They had two clear reasons. Humanitarian image. They wanted to prove to the world that America was civilized, that it respected international law. Once the war was over, this reputation would help the United States rise as a global leader. Psychological strategy. The newspapers didn't just entertain. They made prisoners compare between a prosperous America and a Germany buried under rubble. The more they compared, the less faith they had in Hitler's promises of victory. Years later, some American officers admitted, "Every paper we handed out wasn't for their enjoyment. It was a dose of medicine, making them less aggressive, more divided, and easier to control." Inside the camps, the guards watched daily. They saw young Germans talk less about Hitler and more about baseball or Hollywood films. They noticed arguments were no longer about battle tactics, but about whether American refrigerators in ads really existed. One lieutenant wrote in his report, "Since newspapers were introduced, POW morale has visibly declined. They show less discipline, more debate, and even split into factions. This is a clear psychological effect." For many American soldiers, these scenes brought a unique satisfaction. After so much loss on the battlefield, they could now watch their enemies unravel without a single bullet. Some guards said outright, "This is the gift we give back to them, not with rifles, but with printed words." Yet behind the smirks, there was also a trace of sadness. One soldier confessed quietly, "They're still just people." Watching them read, worrying about families back home, I can't help but think of my own wife and kids. War is madness. But then the bugle sounded and duty snapped them back. To the Americans, prisoners were still prisoners, only now, instead of iron chains, they bound them with something far subtler. Newspaper chains made of fragile paper but strong enough to hold minds captive. Mornings in the camp no longer began with just the creak of the roll call whistle, but with the rustle of newspapers being passed from hand to hand. Even before the sun fully lit the yard, small groups of prisoners huddled together, bending over the pages, devouring each line, whispering translations to one another. Dieter, the best English speaker among them, became the camp's unofficial announcer. Each time fresh papers arrived, he held one up, read aloud, and carefully translated. Around him, a circle of weary faces lit up, eyes sparkling like children listening to a fairy tale. "Listen to this," Dieter said one morning. "The Americans just held a singing contest in Chicago. Thousands of people attended, and the winner was a 19-year-old girl. A collective gasp rose. They have singing contests in the middle of a war?" Another prisoner gave a bitter smile. "In Berlin, the only music we hear is bombs falling." On another day, the paper showed an advertisement for a new car. A sharp image. A family of 4 cruising down a highway, wind in their hair, smiles wide. Otto sighed. A brand new car in wartime. America must be unimaginably wealthy. The men didn't just read. They began to write. Using bits of cardboard, scraps of paper, even torn newspaper edges, they started keeping journals. One wrote, "Today I learned Americans have refrigerators in their homes. I can't imagine it. At home, we bury food in the ground to keep it cool." Another scribbled, "The paper showed an American actress. I've never seen such a cheerful face during wartime. If this war ever ends, I want to watch an American movie." For many, the newspapers were not just news. They were windows for dreaming, for escaping the wooden walls, the barbed wire, and the long, cold nights. Some even treated them like sacred charms. One prisoner hid a paper beneath his pillow as if it were a talisman. When guards found it, they only laughed. To them, the fact that prisoners clung to newsprint so dearly was proof the plan was working, yet not everything was harmless. One evening, Dieter read news of a German defeat on the Eastern Front. The room tightened like a drawn bowstring. Some prisoners wept, trembling at the thought of their families back home. Others shouted angrily, "Lies! It's all fabricated." The tension flared again. Hans, more isolated than ever, growled, "You've forgotten your honor. You believe the enemy instead of your own country." Karl snapped back, his voice cracking. "What country, Hans?" "Berlin is ashes, and we're locked up here. That's the truth." A shove. A few chairs toppled, but this time the fight didn't erupt as before. Perhaps the men were simply too tired. They no longer had the energy to brawl, only the weight of despair and confusion. In a corner, Otto whispered to Karl, "You know, sometimes I just wish the war would end. If I had to stay in America for a few more years, maybe I wouldn't even mind." Karl stared at him in surprise, then nodded faintly. He had thought the same, but never dared say it aloud. From afar, the American guards kept watch. A sergeant noted in his report, "Prisoners no longer show unity. They split into factions, they argue. Some admire American life. Some fall into despair. Their fighting spirit has clearly declined. But for the prisoners, it all revolved around those fragile sheets of newsprint. They carried not just information, but hope, envy, fear, and dreams never known before. And each page, thin as a butterfly's wing, had the weight to shake the very core of their beliefs. Time passed, and the fragile newspapers kept arriving daily at the POW camp. They slowly became part of life for the men who once wore German uniforms. Some days they awaited the news eagerly. Other days they trembled, afraid of more bad tidings from home. But whether joy or sorrow, their eyes could not turn away from those pages. One cold winter morning, Carl sat quietly at the wooden table, reading an article that said the war was nearing its end. His heart felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter with the hope of freedom soon. Heavier with the knowledge that his homeland was broken. He folded the paper and sighed. Maybe everything we believed in was only a dream, now shattered. Hans, still clinging to defiance, snatched the paper and shouted, "No, this is a lie. The Americans want us hopeless, but the Reich will rise again." Yet his voice trembled, his eyes unsure. Even he could see the cracks forming in his faith. Meanwhile, Otto kept learning English from the papers. One day he chuckled to Carl, "You know, if I ever lived here, I'd buy a newspaper every morning. I'd read about baseball, about music, not about war anymore." Carl nodded, gaze distant. Maybe living an ordinary life is the real victory. Such conversations spread beyond their small circle. Slowly, more prisoners began to dream, not of parades and slogans, but of quiet homes, morning newspapers, and warm meals. The American guards kept watching. They had achieved their goal. The POWs were no longer fanatical soldiers, but ordinary men, divided in thought, weaker in will. Some US officers wrote in reports, "We don't have to force them. We only need to let them see America, one headline, one picture at a time. They'll change themselves." Still, debate continued in America. Some praised the humanitarian approach. They're human too. They have families. Treating them well proves we're civilized. Others were outraged. While my son dies in Europe, the enemy sits in a camp reading newspapers, eating well, living in comfort. Is that justice? There was no single answer. For the German prisoners, the newspapers were comfort, pain, arguments, bridges, and invisible chains binding their minds. For the Americans, the newspapers were a unique weapon, not spilling blood, yet shaking the will of the enemy. When the war finally ended, many prisoners were released. Some left with memories of humiliation and division. Others carried secret dreams of a free, prosperous America glimpsed in those papers. A few later returned, immigrated, married, and built quiet lives in the very country that had once held them captive. Years later, Carl recalled with a faint smile, "We came to America as enemies. But the newspapers made us realize the world was not only war. Maybe that was the greatest lesson I ever learned." The story of newspapers in German POW camps in America is more than history. It proves that sometimes the greatest power is not in weapons, but in information and human decency. A single newspaper can spark arguments, even fights, but it can also open dreams of a world more peaceful, more human. So the questions remain. Was America too humane or too clever? Was it genuine kindness or a shrewd strategy to break the enemy's will? The answer lies in each person's own mind. And for you, if you were an American soldier then, would you hand out the papers? If you were a prisoner, would you believe what you read? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to follow the channel to discover more untold stories of history.